Hi, everybody. I'm Joy Ting from the Virginia Winemakers Research Exchange, and I'm here with Harvest Tips for Winemakers. Tip number 6, beware of high Brix reds. We have a lot of vintage variation here in Virginia. As I record this in September of 2023, we are enjoying a very dry growing season throughout most of the Commonwealth. These conditions are leading to some very good quality fruit, and we are not complaining. Several winemakers have reported picking red grapes earlier and at higher Brix than usual. Since we are more likely to have experience with chaptalization than high Brix, I wanted to send out a few reminders to ensure that you make the most of the reds this vintage. This material was developed in 2019 and is already available in written form on the WRE website. Many thanks to Nicola Hall of Scott Labs and Eglantine Chauffeur of La Mothe Abiette for their insights developing that initial material. Before we talk about fermentation of high Brix reds, a few reminders from previous videos to keep in mind when harvesting this fruit. Dry conditions may lead to higher sugar in the grapes simply because there is less water around. This doesn't necessarily mean that the grape has completed the other aspects of ripening. Pyrazine doesn't really decline until the grapes are physiologically ripe. This is true even if the ceiling for Brix is higher than in most years. The same is true for the berry aromatic sequence and phenolic maturity. If you're picking reds on Brix alone, these other parameters may not be as far along as you might expect. If the seeds are not brown, you will want to be careful to avoid extended macerations in order to avoid green character and bitter phenolics. Once you bring this fruit into the winery, there are several things to keep in mind as you plan and manage the fermentation. These are all things that are true for any red wine fermentation, but are even more important to keep in mind when fermenting high Brix fruit. Make sure you calculate the potential alcohol so you know what you're dealing with. Unfortunately, if your fruit is above 25 Brix, many of our usual conversion factors are less accurate and will underestimate alcohol. If you have access to lab data for glucose and fructose, you can use the equation shown here to calculate more accurately. One of the biggest risks with high Brix is a stuck fermentation, leaving sugar behind that can feed spoilage organisms. So this is the time to do everything you can to maintain healthy, happy yeast. Once you know your potential alcohol, choose a yeast strain that can tolerate that level. Remember that stress is cumulative, and the tolerances listed in the catalog represent the upper limits. Other stressful factors make the yeast less tolerant. Raise your yeast to go the distance. Make sure you rehydrate carefully and avoid temperature shocks. If you don't usually use rehydration nutrients, this might be the one time you make an exception. Consider aerating the fermentations early on. Yeast use oxygen to make sterols that help stabilize their cell membranes. As soon as fermentation starts, there's plenty of CO2 around, so as long as yeast are active, there's little risk of oxidation at this stage. Another way to maintain happy, healthy yeast is to make sure they have the nutrients they need to replace damaged cell components. We talked all about nutrients in tip number 4, so I'll just remind you here that adequate nitrogen helps prevent stuck fermentations. As fermentation progresses, it becomes harder and harder for cells to maintain cell membranes. Heat makes that even harder. However, for red wines, we do want some heat for extraction. A good rule of thumb is to keep these fermentations below 82 degrees Fahrenheit in order to prevent heat stress to the yeast. Monitor fermentations at least once per day by measuring Brix and temperature and smelling and tasting each one. If you put these in a spreadsheet, it's easy to plot the curve so you can see if things are going too fast or too slow. Catching things early means you have more choices for fixing problems before they go too far. At higher Brix, the ratio of glucose to fructose may shift so that the grape has more fructose than glucose. This is more prevalent in grapes that have begun to shrivel. The problem is that yeast transport these sugars together. Transport stops when glucose is used up, leaving residual fructose behind. If you have overripe fruit that has started to shrivel, You may want to inoculate with the strain of Saccharomyces baianus toward the end of fermentation. Baianus is fructophilic and will consume that residual fructose. Any sugar that remains at the end of fermentation can be used by spoilage organisms like Brettanomyces to produce off aromas and flavors. If you plan to age the wine before bottling, confirm that the residual sugar is less than 1 gram per liter. If it's not, a little aeration, heating, or stirring might help finish things off. So remember, beware of high Brix reds. Good winemaking decisions and monitoring can avoid the dangers of stuck fermentations and lead to powerful, delicious wines.